Welcome to part 2 of the AMC interview with John Goss. In this second session, we pick up the story in 1973 when John was already a well-established star in touring cars, had extended his racing into sports sedans and even the fearsome Formula 5000s. The story continues to include his unsuccessful appearance at the Le Mans 24-hour race in a Porsche. John's early career rivals all of his contemporaries. He raced there, he won there. That could have been his motto. Now, John, welcome back to the studio. I think we'll start now. We finished off roughly in 1973. One of the things that we didn't talk about from the 73 year was the car that you built for sports sedan racing, the lightweight XA GT hardtop Ford. That was, I think, one of the most successful and certainly one of the most popular cars of that sports sedan era, when sports sedans were at their absolute peak of interest, support. People absolutely loved sports sedan racing at that time because they were traditional looking motor cars. They weren't plastic fantastics. They were proper sedan motor cars in a sports sedan or a stripped out form with lots of power, handling which was, let's call it, challenging. Tell us, first of all, why did you build the car and what was it like driving it against the competition, which was fairly stiff at the time?
I thought I could see a way to create a car based on the Falcon, which could be competitive. And because of the freedom in that category, there are a lot of exotic approaches to the solution, without mentioning names or cars, but some of those cars were virtually single-seater, 5-litre North Atlantic Formula 5000s with bodywork draped across them. That's really what it got down to. But I had a lot of faith in the general dynamics of the Aussie Ford Falcon. It was a fantastic car, and I thought we could take a simple approach, which I could manage to undertake with the resources I had. And Bruce Richardson was with me at the time when we undertook this. And I thought that if we took the two-door Falcon and lightened it by fitting all the detachable panels by replicating them in composite material and moving the engine back a little bit so that the engine was still in the original bay that it was designed to be in. And so that's what we did. And it was an outstanding machine. That car was so fast. And it had good power. We used the 351 Cleveland, 5.8 litres, with Hillborn fuel injection, economical, low-cost, simple equipment. The engine was there with a conventional clutch bolted to the flywheel, and then the standard Ford gearbox with close ratios, and the standard Ford rear axle assembly. In both cases, there was a wide band of ratios available to us. Wheels were aluminium alloy. I think Oranger made the wheels for us. And the tyres we selected from the Goodyear inventory, they were just a stage up in section and traction ability than the sort of tyres we had to use in series production. But the car was quick. It had incredible acceleration. Even on a tight circuit like Amaru Park, it was able to compete with John McCormick's Charger, which was a hybrid car with a lot of technology in it. So all in all, it was to summarise, it was an idea that I had, a concept that I thought would be effective, and it proved to be so. It was a very effective, modest budget effort, and Max McLeod backed it all the way, and we built it up on a standard body chassis unit that Broadmeadows sent up to us. So there wasn't a lot of modification to the actual bare body chassis shell, but the modification, I tried to restrict it to those assemblies that had to be bolted to the shell, and that's what we did. So the actual chassis of the car was really unchanged, except that we moved the engine back 10 inches. And to do that, we just had to make a minor intrusion into the standard firewall. So the rear cylinders came back into that area.
By comparison with an improved production touring car with the same effective body shell, what was the differences in the two cars to drive, in terms of on-track performance?
The principal areas of performance in any racing car, really, I suppose, are power, grip and brakes. And in all three areas, the car was much, much superior. We were able to fit it with much bigger brakes, for example. Because of the dramatic reduction in weight and, crucially, restoring or improving the balance front to rear by moving the engine back, because that was a bulky engine to move back. The car was just incredibly dynamic. It had so much acceleration. If you could control it coming off a fast curve, you could have it into a sort of a mild, minuscule power slide. And I mean, in the rear axle, I had a locking differential. It wasn't a clutch action, so it was a positive action. It was either locked or not. But when that thing locked, there was no wheel spin driving through the corners. It was just fantastic. So it had incredible acceleration compared to a touring car. Brakes were much more effective, and it was more agile to turn in and everything else because it was lighter, and the weight distribution was a lot better. Can't remember what it was. We calculated it, but it was probably, I'm going to guess there, it's probably irrelative, but it was a lot better than it was as a standard touring car.
It certainly, lives in people's memories long afterwards as a car that was absolutely fantastic to watch.
Yeah.
And I still have memories of it coming off the last corner at Amaroo Park, absolutely sideways, almost dragging the rear bumper bar on the fence on the outside of the corner, heading up the hill. You were almost to the control tower before you got it straight.
It was an incredible car to power slide because it had so much grip, and you could get it into that attitude and balance it through a fast corner. It was very good at Oran Park because of the contours, even the elevation on the various corners around that circuit. No, it was an exciting car to drive, that's for sure.
Let's move on to 74. One of the more interesting questions about 74, which of course is the year that you won Bathurst. You went to Bathurst that year with the older XA model of the Falcon two-doors, and pretty much everybody else was running the XB. Why was that? Was it different in weight or different in mechanically? Well,
the Ford company decided to, Howard Marsden principally as their manager. Howard and Howard used to keep me well informed with what they were doing, and he was most supportive to what we were trying to do. Now and again, I probably broke protocol a bit with some of the various forays I made into the support they gave us at Ford. But Howard decided to campaign, looking ahead into the 73 season, given that the XA model had been introduced in 1972, looking ahead, Howard decided to campaign a single phase 3 for Alan Moffat in the Touring Car Championship, which would take them well up into the winter months towards the long distance series. And that suited Ford's strategy at the time. They were difficult times. I think it was a more economic cost to the company overall than going straight to a full campaign with the two-door version of the car for endurance racing. He was proven to be right because Alan won nearly all the rounds of the Touring Car Championship in the same works car that he'd competed in at Bathurst before, or a sister car to it. But that car now had the advantages of all the freedoms in the new regulation structure. So it had much improved grip, bigger rim sections, bigger tyres, of course, bigger brakes, a lot more horsepower because of the engine freedoms in the new rule. It was still the narrow track Falcon from the era before. So Alan demonstrated, he provided a season in that year's Touring Car Championship. It was a demonstration of real car control because he balanced that car through all of those, I think, 7 races from memory. And I think he won most of them, but of course they won the Touring Car Championship. In the meantime, they had declined to advance to cams to homologate the freedoms which we already had homologated for the Phase 3. Things like aluminium, water pump and clutch housing, lightweight housings, a tuned tri-Y, they call it, 8-branch exhaust system, and above all, ratios for both the gearbox and the rear axle. So
these were all things that were homologated for the Phase 3 GTHO, but not for the two-door.
That's right. They'd been introduced progressively from Ford's North American inventory to facilitate the previous Falcon series production program between 69 and 72. The square riggers, I call them, the mighty cars, And I mean, in the end, when I went to Bathurst in 69, the HO was running down the Conrod Straight, I think, at about 130 miles an hour. No, 128 or 130 miles an hour. But 2 years later, my Phase 3 was running down there at over 145 miles an hour. So they were quick cars, but they were limited in many areas, and we had to live with that and learn to drive them, and I managed to do that. But the thing is that those homologated components that we utilised in that program, we were not able to utilise them with the XA until Ford had been successful in gaining recognition from CAMS for those options to be applied to the newer model XA. So, and by the way, by that time I'd completed 8,500 miles of racing and testing in my Phase 3 over 2 seasons. So that car, that's how many miles I did in it, because the speedo was always connected in those 2 years. So she'd done a lot of work, and I wanted to look ahead. I was intrigued by the two-door. I considered it to be a lot more effective aerodynamically, and it was slightly wider in track. So dynamically, the cornering speeds should have been better. The car would be more stable at a lower centre of gravity, and it was better aerodynamically. So we undertook to campaign it in selected rounds of the Touring Car Championship, but we were restricted with horsepower and ratios because of the aforementioned structure that Ford had considered necessary. So for the first half of 73, I only did 2 or 3 rounds of the Touring Championship because I was very heavily involved, I think, with Laurie O'Neill with his Porsche, and I was getting closer to thinking about trying to do something in the Formula 5000, and I think, was still racing the Tornado coming to the end of that stage, so I was busy. And I ran that car through those isolated rounds, but straight away I found that even with reduced horsepower, we could, in cornering speeds, the car was already superior with the restricted horsepower. It was a better car. But I looked forward to the time when we'd have those freedoms recognised and homologated, and therefore I'd considered earlier it wasn't really practical to enter the Touring Car Championship overall because we'd have been outclassed a bit in terms of power. So and I think in fact earlier on in the program we even had to run drum brakes at the rear. I'm not sure about that. But to cut a long story short, in the calendar year 73, the ARDC organised their annual Easter meeting. In that meeting, there were a couple of events which were structured as combined sports and touring car events. So I entered the car for that, and now I applied some of the critical components that I was confident would be homologated and recognised when Ford came into campaigning the cars as manufacturers. And we went to Bathurst. I thought about the ratios, and I fitted the car with a combination of gear ratios, rear axle and gearbox that I thought it needed. I fitted it with the aerodynamic device at the front, which I thought we'd see, which was already a Ford part, and a wing on the tail. And I knew that Harry Firth would be there with a Holden dealer team, so I fitted some decoy developments, which I thought might have taken the focus off what their considered strategy might have been, that we're up there doing secret testing for the 1000. But I was able to do that. I was well within my rights because it was a sports sedan race. So I remember that I rigged an oil cooler on the left-hand roll bar hoop inside the cabin of the car, and the scrutineers rejected that. And we quickly put that back to wherever it was, whatever it was. We did away with that mod. But to cut a long story short, we were able to start in those races with front and rear aerodynamic devices, with a ride height configuration and pitch angle that I knew the car would need on the fast circuit at Bathurst, and significantly a combination of gearbox and rear axle ratios that I knew should work well. And we found that it was just a real sweet combination. The ratios were great. Nobody knew that we'd done that. And so I think we competed in 2 races and did quite well. I can't remember the result, but there were only a couple of cars finished ahead of me, and that was probably Ian Gagan and Bob Jane, and I think Alan Moffat was there as well. But it was a good result, and I came home to Rockdale knowing that we'd really taken a good step forward in confirming the gear ratios that we were going to need some months hence, or some months later in the main event. And that's the way it turned out. When we got to Bathurst, now with all the homologated options fitted to the car, it was quick straight away, and Kevin and I had a good time with it in practice, and I managed to qualify it on pole position. When the race started, the advantages we had were so patently obvious, because the gearing combination I had brought the car out of the 2 slow corners. Each lap we gained about a car and a half's length out of those 2 slow corners, each lap. And the result was that we steadily drew away from the whole field and dominated the race all day till the incident we had later in the day and had to retire. So to get back to answer your question, I believed the XA, of course, would be superior. Anyone else would have thought the same thing, but it didn't suit Ford as a manufacturer to move into developing those cars earlier in 73. That gave us a chance to discreetly do a bit of ratio testing and stuff at that Easter Bathurst, and that was crucial to us when we came up for the main event.
Yes, in that era when there were 2 events that you could do that in at Bathurst, Easter and October, it made a lot of difference. I know because Harry ran the XU2, the V8 Tirana.
Yeah.
There was a lot of sort of jiggery-pokery going on around about that time, and it was all above board because, as you said, it was all legitimate because it was a sports sedan race, and therefore you could bring pretty much anything to it. Okay, so moving on from there, we're now talking about early 74, and obviously you had in your mind the next step of your career, and you must have been talking off and on for some time to Frank Maddich about moving into Formula 5000, into open wheelers. Obviously, that was at the time when Frank was considering retiring anyway. And, I mean, Frank had been the benchmark in Formula 5000. Yeah. He'd been the benchmark in the Tasman Series on many occasions.
Yeah, Frank Maddich was a benchmark in Australian motor racing, full stop. He was a man I admired. I took notice of his technique and his style of driving, his delivery of power. And, of course, I had worked with him on the SR3s and 4s. And I knew him through my association. Earlier on, I admired him as a competitor way back to the late 60s, but at places like Longford. But I got to know Frank more closely when I was working on his engines at Repco Brabham. And that led to me working as his engine man on 2 or 3 events that Maddich Racing entered, including the 6-hour race at Surfers Paradise with Peter Mavey as chief mechanic. I admired Frank. He wasn't the sort of bloke who'd go down to the pub, although he did like to go to the pub now and again, so I believe, but I didn't go down to the pub with him at any time. But he was a determined, articulate, considered engineering participant. He knew that side of it, and that was my area as well. So we shared that in common. I don't think I ever approached Frank and asked him if I could drive one of his cars, but I know that he considered it. And that was probably 74 maybe, and I think Colin did a couple of events in the M10 McLarens when Frank had an M10A and B, I think, and I think Colin drove the M10A once or twice, once at Warwick Farm, I remember. And I noticed that and I thought, gee, that'd be good. Frank, I think, considered that I might have been able to come into his operation. But the brief discussion we ever had about it was usually curtailed or limited because I was aligned with Ford Motor Company, and there was no question of me getting enough support from Ford out on the edge of their racing interest to develop a 5-litre engine for those chassis. As it is, we did that ourselves later. But so in that early period of my relationship with Frank, in consideration of competing in Formula 5000, I purchased one of the 3 CAC manufactured chassis that Frank had, chassis 005, I think it was, which was the third last car that he'd competed. That car, I think, had been to the States and back, and I purchased that from Frank. It would have been the winter of 74 probably, but I purchased it on a sort of a lay-by basis and I purchased it as a rolling chassis because the car was up on the pallet rack in his workshop. And I said, gee, Frank, I'd like to do something with it and put a Ford engine in it. And he was fully cooperative of that, but he couldn't really help me with it. And there were some discussions between myself and Peter Mabey and Ford Motor Company, but they didn't go anywhere because Ford had no real reason as a volume manufacturer to get involved with that side of it. So I purchased that car, and it rested there on that pallet rack for nearly a year while I went on with all the other racing that I did at the time. And eventually I started to make plans to fit a 5-litre version of the Cleveland engine into the chassis with a view to going and taking delivery of that car, which remember was a rolling chassis. And then probably around about that time, Frank got closer to his retirement and he advertised 007, which was the last of the 3 CAC monocoque versions. They were A52s and A53s in that spectrum or that range of development. So in the meantime, I'd been driving the 12 months previously, I'd been driving Laurie's Porsche, and I think I competed locally at Oran Park. I think on one night I won 7 of the 8 feature races and 5 of them in the Porsche. But Laurie fancied having Pete Gagan drive it, I think, and I was informed that I wouldn't be driving that car anymore, and it was a bit of a relief to me because we didn't have the resources to maintain it. And so I'd been separated from driving Laurie's Porsche, and there was no animosity. And but a little bit more time went by, probably 6 or 8 months or more, and then Frank had advertised the A53, and I think I approached Frank and asked him if there was any chance of me obtaining the car. I wasn't able to advance to buy that car, but I still had my A51 on the pallet rack upstairs, which was the 005, and 006 had been destroyed for revenue reasons or tax because Bob Muir had a bad accident with it at Oran Park. So of the 3 CAC manufactured monocoques, only 2 were left, 005 and 007. Anyway, I was working away one evening. The phone rang in the Ford dealership and somebody answered the phone and came over to tell me. And it was Laurie O'Neill. And Laurie said to me, John, I understand you've been interested in Frank's. He knew I'd already purchased the first car. He said, I understand that you're interested in perhaps purchasing Frank's A53 as he now formalises his retirement. Anyway, Laurie said to me, if you come around to my place in the morning and see Ruth, there'll be a cheque for you. And so I did so, and a little while later, I had a phone call from Joan Mattich that same evening, and Joan said, congratulations, John. So Laurie O'Neill had offered to underwrite my purchase, given the equity I already had in the other car. And that car stayed with Mattich's at that time. So I took delivery of the A53. I went over to see Frank, and he said, "Look, John, you'll need a lot more than you need more than just the car." So in the end, I ended up coming away from Frank's place, not that night, but he provided me with his transporter on loan to go to Oran Park the next weekend or so, which was a round of the Gold Star, as I remember. And so I went out to Oran Park, and then Frank said, "You'd need some help too." And so he introduced me to Grant O'Neill and Peter Hughes. Peter was a brilliant machinist, a tool maker, in fact, and Grant was a brilliant fabricator. So the three of us all went out to Oran Park with Maddich Racing's little compact international van and the trailer with the car on the back. That's how I ran my first 5,000 race. So Laurie O'Neill subsidised the initial purchase, and I was grateful for that critical time in my life because it gave me access to a good machine, well sorted, and I was able to get a good result with it right from the start.
Yeah, your sort of, if you would, conversion from touring cars to open wheelers was almost seamless. I mean, you just got in the car and understood it, drove it extremely well. You presented it also very, very well. I mean, the car was, I think from memory, the car was painted blue pretty much from the start.
No, when I took delivery, it was McLaren orange, which colour Frank had always used. He had a very close relationship with Bruce, and but we painted it blue very soon after that. Goss racing blue, we used to call it, but true blue we also called it. But you know, Laurie had come forward and helped me to get into that car as a going concern. That was the critical part about it. And within a year or so, I returned that loan to him, and it was just a happy, wonderful time in my life to think that Laurie had come back to me and supported me again, you know.
Yes, I mean, Laurie O'Neill is a name that keeps cropping up in the history of contemporary motor racing in this country. And
top-level competitors.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, he was one of those guys that really enjoyed the sport, had the financial ability to pick out people who he wanted to support.
Yeah.
I have one little memory of Laurie O'Neill where I was driving into Warwick Farm one day when we stopped at the gate to wait for driving across the circuit between events. And I was sitting behind Laurie's brand spanking new Aston Martin DB4 GTZ, white, pristine, the car that eventually Pete Gager drove in some GT races. Oh. And in the back window of the car was a little tiny sign. It was about maybe, a foot long, few inches high, beautifully typeset. And it said, you might remember in those days, you bought a new car, you ran it in.
Yeah.
Well, we don't do that sort of thing today, but in those days you did. And the sign read, running in, please pass. And then underneath that it said, while you can.
He was a character, Laurie.
He certainly was. Now, look, that leads you into 1975.
Yeah.
1975, final round of the Tasman Series. That was the year that Johnny Walker went through the fence at Sandown, and you came home as the winner.
Yeah.
Now, where does that place in terms of how many Formula 5000 races had you driven up until that point? It couldn't have been many.
Oh, no, actually quite a few more than we think. I drove all of the, it's a good question, Ray, but I drove all of the Aussie rounds for 3 consecutive years. So that's 12 Tasman rounds.
Yeah.
Rothman's Trophy it became, or whatever it was. But then I took the car across to Perth and competed in the inaugural Western Australian Grand Prix. We won that, of course. So I did some extraordinary events, and the Grand Prix in those 3 years were usually separate. So that would have been probably, I would have done 16 or 18 events in those 3 years.
Yeah, in those 3 years. But the race that you won at 75 must have been quite early on in that.
No, in 70...
Because you got the cars in end of 74?
That's right. But there were 3 seasons. So I always planned to do 3 seasons. And there was one car I got. But 005 was eventually purchased by a Sydney gunsmith, Kevin Loy, a really nice guy. And Kevin built it up as an amateur effort. Peter Hughes and Grant both did a lot of work for him. Got it reassembled with the conventional Repco Holden engine in it, and drove it himself a little bit here and there. He was a really pleasant man, Kevin, and he used to talk to me a bit about setup and everything else, but he was an amateur competitor in the true sense, never got anything what his way, but he wanted to do it properly. And then he bought Lella Lombardi out, and she drove the car, you see. And I got to know Lella and talked to her a little bit about what I knew about the setup on those cars. But so chassis 005, which Kevin Loy campaigned for a couple of years, 18 months maybe, it came into the market again. And it ended up over in a workshop that Max Stewart and Kevin Bartlett had at Manly. And it was languishing there. And I was in touch with Kevin Loy, and I told him that I'd be interested in buying the car and I'd like to buy it. And he invited me to go over and have a look. I went over, and when I went over to have a look at it, Max particularly was very, what's the word, bit standoffish. I think they were hoping to get hold of it themselves, you know. But anyway, I wrote a check out for Kevin Loy, and I remember it was a pleasure to deal with him because he had a very compact little contract for sale all drawn up. He was Jewish, Kevin, and he had a commercial mind, you know. But so I went back the following day with our trailer, and we brought the car around to Mortlake and pulled it apart and proceeded to develop it, upgrade it to the A53 specification. So that's how I ended up with two of those cars. So for the second and third years of the 3-year program that I laid out, I always had possession of those two cars. But the first task was to bring chassis 005 to 007 standard. That required moving the steering rack further forward out of the monocoque with a new front subframe. We had the jigs and drawings for all of that. We built that up. And some major changes at the back of the car, and bringing the radiator out of the nose to side radiators. But the original Matic A53 side radiator layout, I thought we could do better than that. So I dispensed with the cowlings, big ducts, big flat ducts on each side of the car. And I took the radiators further aft and raked them back along the line of the rear radius arms. And so the two cooling radiators, larger water radiator on the right, smaller one on the left with an oil cooler behind it for the engine's oil. That was really the A53G Goss development. And so the majority of the races I did with the Matic is because I did that side radiator conversion on the first car, 007, quite early. And it was highly successful because it was less weight, less clutter, less drag, and the weight distribution was okay. I asked Frank about it, and he said you'd probably want to watch the weight distribution, but it made no difference that I could feel. But they were great cars, so I was lucky to be able to find myself in the Matic chassis with the Repco engine. The Repco engine had limitations, but it was still a 400 horsepower engine, and I had a lot of knowledge about the protocol and the philosophy behind the whole approach to Repco that Repco had towards producing those engines. Because Repco, when they developed Jack Brabham's request, they developed an overhaul and modification program for the Climax engines in the Tasman days of the 2.5 litre formula. But Jack saw the potential for a lightweight production aluminium cylinder block, and he bought one back as cabin baggage on a Qantas flight from America and talked Frank Hallam into undertaking that job. And that's how the Formula One engine developed, the quad cam 60 series and later on 70 series engines, which I worked on. But in that period, Repco were looking ahead, and they were working on a version of the 308 Holden engine for Formula 5000. And that engine, that Holden engine, which was the engine core that would have been in the L34, it had strengthened main bearing webs and one thing and another. It was originally a Cadillac engine. So that's a little bit of a background story on the development, the genesis of those two Repco efforts. The 5000 engine was always pretty well the same configuration, but the FIA rated Formula engines and engines we did for Indianapolis were totally prototypical. They were fully free development engines, you see. So those two, when I came away from Frank's, I was able to acquire the three of the four engines four engines. The four engines that Frank had supplied to him as part of his contract with Repco, I was able to take away, I think, three of them at that time, because one of them Kevin Loy bought with the A51 chassis 005. But after I bought that, I had all four of the Matic allocated Repco engines. Two of them, one of them was a flat plane engine, but I had a flat plane crankshaft and we developed the second one as a flat plane engine. So the flat plane engines had increased torque, but they weren't really suitable for a 5000 that wasn't designed to withstand the frequencies, and the Matic chassis was. So just trying to think where I'm going with your question. There's a lot of valuable stuff in here. You'll take a lot of it out that it's not relative, but the result was that if I made a mistake strategically, it might be pursuing the Ford engine fitment into the chassis in those 3 years, because I was still doing touring car racing and one thing and another. And at that time, getting closer, I could see the writing on the wall for the Ford program, and I was starting to investigate whether we could do something with the XJS, and that's another story. It'll come later. But those trends overlap. So I'm only mentioning that because you can understand how busy I was trying to keep, and I was employing the guys, running the whole thing, and organising the revenue through sponsorships and partnerships to keep it all going. But the Matic program, if I made one mistake, it might be that I fulfilled that endeavour of fitting that engine into the car, and at the same time developed a one-piece front wing for it, all aluminium, polished aluminium, did away with the original nose with a diminutive little nose, but a one-piece wing, which I'd been inspired by the Ferrari 512 wing on their Formula One car at about that time. Now, we took both cars to Sandown for one of those rounds, and I tested both of them, but fell back onto the Repco 007. But 005, it was the other way around. It was 007 that we put the Ford engine into with the one-piece wing. But I fell back on a 005, the Repco engine, for that race, and I can't really remember without looking at my own files whether it was a round of the Tasman or one of the Grand Prix. It might have been a round of the Tasman. But anyway, what I want to just say in conclusion, that Ford engine, we used a standard production. It was a Cleveland engine, but with aluminium heads, but they were still the same type of port configuration. They were prototypical heads that I purloined here within Australia. I can't remember, somebody had them, and I used them for a while, and in the end we returned them to him. So that took a lot of weight out of the engine. But that 5-litre variant of the 302 of the Cleveland engine was modest with outright power output, because we didn't have a lot of time to develop the valve train, so we used a standard part number Ford flat tappet E2 camshaft, which is the same part number that was in the Phase 3 engines. To give you an idea, this will fascinate. You reckon you know a bit about it. I could still a lot more I can tell you. But you can see, as with the Sports Sedan Falcon, I reckon I could create a car, basically a reworked Ford Falcon Australian car, to compete with the best of those sports sedans that was around at the time, including works Porsches, which were being brought in. And I did so with the Matic. And that Falcon Sports Sedan was very much an Aussie Ford Falcon in all its agricultural splendour, you know. But I knew how to drive the thing as well. But the Ford application to the Matic was a repetition of the same story, because I wasn't going to get carried away because we couldn't afford to undertake the development of a roller cam valve train for the engine to give it a lot more power. So I just reached into the Ford inventory and we used a standard part number. We would have had one of those cams, and we just put that in that was with flat tappets. We did have roller rockers on it, but it was a long way short of the sort of duration that engines of that type, a 5-litre engine in that international category, had a lot more overlap and valve endurance and a lot more valve lift. That touring car cam, same cam I had in the Phase 3, put that thing onto the circuit at Sandown, and it was within a few tenths of qualify at the best time on the day. But there were other problems with it, and I thought it was more prudent to fall back onto the Repco, and that's what we did. But the car was quick, and it had tremendous torque out of the corners. That was a 5-litre version of the Cleveland with a flat tappet cam, and Peter Malloy was helping me where he could. But, and I say that out of proper, almost required respect, because we didn't have a budget, and Peter was working for all the rich boys downtown with a lot of money to spend on this 5-litre engines for their 5000s, from Teddy Hip all the way through the spectrum of owners of all of those cars, that were powering the blokes that I had to compete against. So just 5,000 again. There I was with an engine that I'd helped to develop as an Australian, with an Australian car and an Australian engine, and that's the form in which I won the 41st Australian Grand Prix.
And that's what I want to talk about.
Yeah.
Now, that was the 1976 year.
Yeah.
And up until that point, our records show that you hadn't had the world's best year, but that was the race that made you, as I said before, into not only a well-known sportsman across the country, but allowed you to be the person who's won those two events that will never happen again.
No,
I'm absolutely certain of that.
Yeah.
So, that's, as I said before, you're the unicorn, the impossible man.
Yeah, I don't know that I like that. I'll talk about that later. But I mean, the thing is, but the effort that I displayed on that day to win that race is the real achievement, even if I may say it myself, because the night before, given the sort of resources we had and everything else, we weren't able to leave the cars in the pits overnight. And that night I was staying at the Melbourne Hilton, and I didn't want to travel away from the precinct too far. And I had a really sore shoulder because I'd hurt my shoulder driving the bloody Porsche, throwing it around, an athletic car to drive. I stayed at the Melbourne Hilton, and I had a lot of trouble with my back, and Sue said, look, what are you going to do about it? I said, I don't know what I can do. It was, but in the lift, that's right. I noticed when we came into the place, we went back there to have a meal and get some sleep. But in the lift, I met a bloke in the lift, nice man, and we were going up in the lift, and he was going up to the ballroom. And I said, good evening, how are you going? He said, what are you doing? And he said, oh, it's the National Acupuncturist Convention. This is our grand dinner dance, you see. And I said, gee, that's fascinating, isn't it? And he said, you're standing there with a bit of a list. What's wrong? I said, I got a sore back. And he said, and he opened his black tie, he had a beautiful jacket. And he opened and inside were all these needles, So he carried his tools with him, What a story, Ray. It could only come from me, couldn't it?
Absolutely.
I mean,
I'm just sitting here thinking it's going to get weirder, and now it's getting weirder.
So I'm having to deal with this, and I went back and said to Sue Malcolm, my wonderful girlfriend, I said, I told her what had happened. She said, gee, you better go and see him, So because he'd invited me, he said, come back up. So up I go again, up to the ballroom. You'd imagine I've got the Australian Grand Prix in the morning, and here they are, 300 guys from all over the Pacific region having a grand dinner. And anyway, he came out, and he said, oh, no, he said, I'll have a look. He came down to my room, and he was going to provide some acupuncture treatment for me. And I remember I walked into the room. We had a bit of a suite, a fairly big suite, and I sat down, took my jacket off, and when he got his needles out, I looked at him. I had a change of heart. I wasn't afraid of the needle, but I was afraid of the complication of having something that made it worse the following day, that the rule of consistency, And he saw that, and he said, it's all right, John. He said, I understand. So I never did get any treatment. And next morning, I'm going out there with this bloody back problem. It was sort of the whole of my back and spine. It was quite sore at certain angles. And it wasn't the ideal way to be approaching the bloody Grand Prix. So we had the warm-up lap, and in the warm-up lap, the car didn't feel right. At the same time, we'd taken the Falcon down and ended in the bloody Sandown 250. And Jimmy Richards was driving. And I said to Jim, I got a bit on me blade. Could you lead the 250, start the race? So Jim started the bloody race and he got into the lead in the blue number 5 Falcon. And he was settling down. I thought, God almighty, we're going to win this thing again, you know. And then he had to pit, and we had a broken brake pipe at the back, and it spoiled his rhythm. He finished, but when it came time to take the car around to the grid, the Matic, I drove it around with a lot of thought about what I was about to have to deal with. I felt good in many ways. I had everything was right, except I had this question in my mind about the car didn't just feel the way it had typically, you know. We drove around and there was quite a ceremony before the start. So we drove to our allocated grid positions. I think I was on the second row, might have been on the front row, third fastest, I can't remember, but I got out of the car then by direction, by instruction, and walked ahead about 150 metres to where we stood as a group, and the Premier introduced the event or something like that, and Grant was with me. Grant had walked around Shell Corner to be there. All the chief mechanics were all there. And there was that short ceremony, and I remember we turned to walk back to the cars. So now I'm 100 metres away from the front of the grid, and those cars are all there, 12 of them or so. And as I turned around and looked at it, I could see the reason why it wasn't handling as well as I thought. The front cambers were biased off one way, and my chief mechanic saw it at exactly the same time. I could see 100 metres away, I could see the reason. And he saw it too, and our eyes met, and I put my arm on his shoulder. I said, "Don't worry, mate, I'll do the best I can." That's all I said. And he explained to me, as I walked back to the car, he said, "I know what I did wrong." So I got in that car, and I didn't allow it to overwhelm me, but I knew I had a task ahead, you know. The sawback, by that time, I was thinking I've just got to get in here and get into this race and do what I can. I slid down into the thing, put my harness on, and the 1 minute horn blew, and Grant reached down into the cockpit as he always did and hauled down on the shoulder straps till you're really locked into the seat. And he used to always he would always touch me on the shoulder, and his last words would be, "Take care of yourself, mate." I'm sorry, I'm emotional thinking about it. Jesus. And so then you're on your own, you know, and all the thousands of starts I'd made, I was good at that as a mechanic. I knew how to handle it, get a good start, and I got straight into the first corner right up at the head of the field, and it's a thunderous roar all around and behind you, and a lot of bloody troubadours further back in the grid, you know, you wouldn't want to get too near them, you know. But as I got into the race, I started to fall back. I couldn't get the car in the groove like I wanted it because of that handling issue. But as I got into the race, mechanically the car was all right, but I just couldn't get the times out of it in terms of lap times. And I couldn't precisely place it in some of the corners that were critical, like Peter's corner, down past the pits, heavy braking, flick change back to second, and then you had to throw the car into that corner, and typically as you swung through the corner, the front wheels the tail would be stepping just a little bit outside the line of the front wheels. But at Sandown, I'd often come in during practice and I'd say, I think I touched the arm armco there, and we'd see the white smudges on the tyre wall, you know, bloody amazing when I'd talk about it myself. But you wouldn't have time to think, because you'd slide through that corner, second gear, 7.2, so on. Oh, I beg your pardon, 8.250 in the Matic, up the back straight, flat shifting all the way through, and then you'd be weightless in the straps under the Dunlop Bridge going into the very fast. And I wouldn't change down or anything. I'd just trickle the throttle still in fifth gear, and then down towards Dandenong Corner, a double shift back to second. The car was so good. Like, you wouldn't be bothered changing down while you're braking. You'd drive the thing and keep it going. Anyway, we've just done half a lap together, but I'll do the rest of the lap later. But as I got into that race, I had to talk to myself. I psychologically, I'm thinking, this is this is the Australian bloody Grand Prix. I've got to somehow find a way. And I found a way in the end. And if you saw the recording of the race, the ABC filmed it actually. I did fall back, but I managed to start clawing my way back, and I clawed my way all the way back up into the lead. But getting into the actual lead was difficult because I had to deal with Vern, and I had to deal above all with Max. And Max was a real terror to deal with. 3 times I got up alongside his Lola to take the inside running into Shell Corner, and 3 times when it was right for Max, he'd just pull the lock on like that. And we touched twice, wheel to wheel. And in each of those 3 times, I actually ran inside the little low brick margin into the pit lanes about that high, mercifully. Had to run in onto the pit lane to get through, it was a bit of a worry. But the 4th time, I got right alongside him on the straight and got the line into the corner. And after that, it was a matter of competing against Vern because he was asserting himself from behind. But, to think, when I crossed that line, I kept the throttle on all the way around. I couldn't believe it. I thought, Jesus, I've got to make sure I've done enough laps, But anyway, that's how it happened. And I ran the second lap, I ran around, came up and stopped right on the grid. And Diana Davison came running back and reached into the cockpit and kissed me, The emotion. To think in my home birth state to win that Grand Prix. And at the presentation with the Premier, I mentioned Dad because we're a Victorian family, I said something like, I wish he was here, or I think he was here today. But Dad couldn't have believed it. If I think back to 68 Jet Parade, building the Tornado through the winter nights, I couldn't have believed that, less than a decade later, I'd win the bloody Australian Grand Prix. So there you go. You don't have to publish all that, but some terrific memories.
You mentioned talking about Jim Richards earlier, so obviously you spent some time with Jim, who's a wonderful human being.
Yeah, terrific. We had a great friendship.
There's the whole situation about when you went to Le Mans.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of Australian racing drivers have gone to Le Mans. Brock went, Perkins has gone. There's a whole lot of people went there. What was it like? You went there once, is that right?
Yeah, only once. Yeah. I was to go a second time, but we couldn't get it all together. So Nick and I were going to run that event, and Jean was going to join at midnight. And so the first thing was practice. I remember we had a little sheet given to us by the Porsche company, and it said, drivers must be careful when passing the gears, because the cars had a 4-speed wide ratio gearbox, only 4 speeds, and they were 210 miles an hour terminal speed on the Mulsanne straight. Bloody quick car, 750 horsepower or something, But it was a car we never saw out here. The Group 4 was heavily related to what became the Carrera. It's a 911, but it had intercoolers embedded in the front air dam. It had a unique fuel injection unit, twin turbo, so the charge air went through up to the front of the car and back to be cooled before it went into the engine. As I said, 4-speed gearbox, but good BBS running gear. It was a beautiful chassis to drive. And Vern was there. He was driving the George Luce entry, bright red it was. And I met him and talked to him. Big open ablutions area out the back. We used to wash our bodies down during the day. You couldn't get much rest, This was before the era of motorhomes on such a big scale, Anyway, wonderful experience. But we finished that race, but we had trouble. In the early hours of the morning, Nick ran over a little deer and a little miniature animal, and a bone pierced one of the intercooler radiators. We had to bypass it, but we managed to get to the end and finish it.
Was that the year that Brock was there in the BMW?
Yes, he was, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So, I think both of you had interesting days.
Yeah, we did. Yeah, I can't remember what happened to Brocky, but of course, I do remember that at the end of our race, we had, with a few laps to go, the engine was starting to falter, and I had to pit. And the works Porsche mechanics were just a pit or so along, and the problem we were having was with the fuel injection control unit. It wasn't as sophisticated as it is today. It was a very complicated mechanical system about that diameter on the middle of the engine. And I remember that the German works team, they had little railway, the American railway little caps with a square bill and with stripe. And one of them ran up, saw our predicament, and ran up and said, and he fiddled around with it anyway, he fixed it, so we were able to. But in that pit area, I had the Southern Cross stars on the top of my helmet. And when I came into the pits, there was always a gallery of people, all very intimate. Le Mans was then, The success, the support that I got from those French fans was just unreal. As an Australian, I remember that. Yeah, it was great. But at the end of that race, I managed to get out to finish it. And on the last lap, at all the flag points, every one of the marshals came out with every flag in the inventory and waved them. And I can still remember with the beautiful sunlight backlighting those flags at certain angles as I went around the circuit. And around at the signal pits, everybody would be there waving. The race was now coming to an end. And I got around through the Ford chicane and headed up to go to the pits. And there must have been 500,000 people on the pit straight. And I had to go back to first gear and and I couldn't find our team, and they found me in the end. But that was my ending to that Le Mans race. We were going to do it again, but it wasn't to be. But it was an experience, a terrific experience. Through the night was just something else, because all of the drivers were really at a pretty high level, even at my position in that event. But you'd go up past the pits, accelerating all the time, and then turn through the right-hand sweeper, and then up the embankment, quite a bit of a hill, and again, weightless in the straps under the Dunlop Bridge, a short spurt downhill, still flat, and then a chicane, and then settle down for Tetra Rouge, the fast corner onto the right. And earlier in the event, there was a lot of activity, but later on, as the race came close and the race itself, as you went down into that valley, you'd smell all the cooked meat from the barbecues. Thousands of people there barbecuing. But in the night, you'd pull onto that straight, and you now could settle down to a bit of respite, a bit of deep breathing if you felt you needed and that sort of stuff. Now it was courtesy and light control. And then there'd be a blinding flash in the mirrors as somebody in one of the Group 5 cars might have pulled, or prototype cars had pulled on. Immediately they dipped their lights. That's what I remember. And down that long straight, you might have a Group 5 car or a Group, what was the top group? We call them the prototypes. That's the 917s and stuff like that. As they come up, there'd be a passing speed of about 20 miles an hour. So that competitor had come past you like that in the night. And at the right time, you glance across and you'd see Andretti, Prost, or whatever they were. You thought you could store that one for yourself. Oh, great stuff. But it was a terrific event, no doubt about it. But now there are 3 or 4 chicanes in that straight.
Yeah. Slowed it right down.
Yeah.
Which is logical because it was, frighteningly fast.
Yeah.
For a long time too. The length of the straight allowed you to hold that speed for a long time.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, John, Le Mans is like no other event in the world, is it? I'd like to thank you very much for coming in again today. We've only reached about halfway through your career, as amazing as that may seem. So we'll carry on at another time. Thank you very much for coming in. This is Ray Berghaus signing off.
Well, friends, that's the conclusion of another episode of the Australian Muscle Car Magazine podcast series. We hope you enjoyed the tales contained herein and look forward to seeing you again soon. In the meantime, be sure to check out musclecarmag.com.au for news stories, news and galleries from the Muscle Car Vault. We add them weekly, as well as brand new digital issues as soon as they become available on the newsstand. Thanks for listening, and as always, safe driving and happy reading from the team at Australian Muscle Car Magazine.